Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us at ICA Miami on this lovely Saturday afternoon. My name is Donna Honarpiche, and I'm the Associate Curator of Art and Research. I'm delighted to welcome you to our ICA Speaks series, where we invite artists from the museum's permanent collections to speak about their practice. Today, we have the great honor of welcoming an incredible artist in our collection, Rick Lowe, whose work spans both visual art and social practice. We currently have one of his striking works, Black Wall Street number 10 from 2021, on display in our ground floor galleries next door. So if you haven't already seen it, please go and check it out. Many of you might already be familiar with Lowe's profound impact on both the art world and the communities he works in, but for those of you who don't, I'll share a quick bio. Rick Lowe was born in 1961 in rural Russell County, Alabama, and lives and works in Houston. His extensive body of work spans painting, drawing, and installation, as well as collaborative projects undertaken in the spirit and tradition of social sculpture. Working closely with individuals and communities, Lowe identifies ways to exercise creativity in the context of everyday activities, harnessing it to explore concerns around equity and justice. Through such undertakings as Black Wall Street from 2018 to the present, a multifaceted citywide project for which he installed an information ticker in a neighborhood on Chicago's South Side, and Greenwood Art Project, a project from 2018 to 2021, where he worked with local artists and others in Alabama to raise awareness of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. Lowe has developed a flexible practice centered on nurturing relationships and catalyzing change. Lowe is part of numerous collections, including the Brooklyn Museum, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Whitney Museum of American Art, the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden, the National Gallery of Art, the High Museum of Art, the Nerman Museum of Contemporary Art, the Menil Collection, the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, Tate London, the UBS Collection, and of course, our very own ICA Miami. Lowe's work has been featured in many solo exhibitions, including the Art League Houston, Notes on the Great Migration, Neubauer Collegium for Culture and Society, University of Chicago, Hic Sunt Draconis, Here Lay Dragons, Mapping the Unknown, and Benaki Museum in Athens. He also participated in Documenta 14 in Athens in 2017, the Whitney Biennial, and the 60th Venice Biennale in 2024, and I had the pleasure of seeing that exhibition there. Among Lowe's numerous community art projects are Project Row Houses Houston from 1993 to 2018, the Watts House Project Los Angeles 1996 to 2012, Burrow Project with Susan Lacey and Mary Jane Jacob, Charleston, South Carolina in 2003, Small Business Big Change, Anyang Public Art Program Korea in 2010, Translation, Vickery Meadow, Dallas, 2013, Victoria Square Project, Athens, 27 to 2018, Greenwood Art Project, Tulsa, Oklahoma, 2018 to 2021, and Black Wall Street Journey, Chicago, 2021 to the present. In 2013, President Barack Obama appointed Lowe to the National Council on the Arts, and in 2014, he was named a MacArthur Fellow. Lowe was a visiting fellow at the Neubauer Collegium for Culture and Society from 2019 to 2021. In 2024, he was the Roy Lichtenstein Artist in Resident at the American Academy in Rome. He is currently a professor of interdisciplinary practice at the University of Houston. I could go on, but I will conclude there. So we'll leave time for questions, and without further ado, please join me in welcoming Rick Lowe.
So, when I do these talks, up until, prior to COVID, most of the talks I would do would be about my community engaged work. And doing those kind of talks, I never quite knew who I was talking to in those situations, because sometimes it's like fundraising, and so you'd be talking to bankers or something, or housing developers, and sometimes it's art people, sometimes it's community people, it's like all that kind of stuff. And now I have this whole thing of now with the paintings, I throw in a whole other thing, there's another layer of the art world. So I'm always trying to figure out how to do these talks. So I think what I'm going to do today is I'm going to try to, for those who know my painting work, my paintings practice, I'm going to contextualize that with the community engaged work so that you kind of get a better sense of where that comes from. And then for those of you who are familiar with my community engaged work, you'll get a chance to see a bit of how I my practice has evolved and incorporates a more personal, meditative side to my creative work. But I'm going to start very early to show you, because many people, when I was doing community engaged work, they didn't even know that I was trained as a painter. And I was trained as a traditional landscape painter, but by the time I started practicing and doing work as a professional artist, I had shifted to more figurative, didactic works, such as these. This is Suzanne Delahanty's here. This is from her old institution, the Contemporary Arts Museum in Houston. This was a piece that I did that was in. When I was doing work at this point, what I was trying to do was I wanted to figure out, well, when I was first introduced to art, I thought, how can I use art to really transform lives? And one of the ways that I started looking at it was just looking at the kind of way that information entered our society. And if you look at the image on the left-hand side, that's kind of more, that really encapsulate the whole thing, was that I would look through a lot of magazines and stuff, looking at popular media. And it was always striking to me that on one page, you might see something about some terrible thing that was happening in the world. And then right on the opposite page, you see like an ad for a very expensive luxury car or some sexy kind of thing or whatever. And so I thought, at this point, when I was doing this work, I was trying to recontextualize and mush those things together to challenge people to think about how, media production was taking place. This piece was actually about, this lynching of Michael Donnell, who was the last kind of official Klan lynching in America in 1982. He was 19 years old when he was lynched. And it was interesting that I didn't even know about that lynching. I was living in Biloxi, Mississippi at the time that it happened. I didn't know about it until 1985 when I saw an article in the New York Times that was about the case that Morris Deeds, who started the Southern Poverty Law Center, represented the family that sued the Klan, and they took all their possessions. And at that time, I was making this piece, and I had this idea about how racism was shifting at that time. The Klan was taking off the hood, and then you had people like David Duke, who was running for Congress in Louisiana in a suit and tie and that kind of stuff. So I was really, trying to push that agenda here. And the work was intended to be very didactic. This was one that dealt with, this was an outdoor installation that was done in conjunction with a political group that was advocating for justice for the killing of two people by the police. And this was my first beginning to start really thinking about making work and organizing. So I actually made the work that was and installed it, but also organized the press conference through which the whole piece was about. And so while this was, by most standards, was a successful event and successful piece, it was around the same time that after taking this down and having a friend of mine bring the students by my studio, and one of the students were looking at this kind of work and was complimenting me on it. But before he left, he said, well, if you're artist and you're creative, why can't you create solutions? Because we already know what the problems are. It's like we need solutions. And so that's the thing that kind of pulled the rug from under me and started me to thinking about, what does it mean to create, for an artist to do work that is poetic and symbolic, and has an aesthetic agenda, but also has a practical application. Anyway, so that took me out of the studio for a while, and I ended up starting Project Row Houses. I'm going to go through 3 projects that I've worked on over time, go through them fairly quickly. But Project Row Houses was the first, and it kind of formed itself out of this combination of 2 artists that I was, that helped shape the idea for it. First of all, it was Joseph Boyd's idea of social sculpture, which, I was curious about what that meant, and when I start reading it, and Joseph Beuys defines social sculpture as the way in which we shape and mold the world around us. So I was really interested in that. How do you shape and mold the world? And so at some point I was with a group of people, and we were, well, there was a group of community leaders. They had organized a tour of the neighborhood, this neighborhood called the Third Ward in Houston, and they had city and county officials on this bus, and they were showing them all these places that they wanted torn down because they were all terrible. And one such place was the houses where Project Row houses exist now. But the thing was, I connected this idea of these shotgun houses to the work of John Biggers. And John Biggers was a African-American artist that started the art department at Texas Southern University, which is a historically black college in Houston. And he had been making these paintings about shotgun houses and showing them with such reverence and beauty. And I started thinking about, these houses, which was here. I started thinking about these houses and thinking, how does John Biggers see the beauty in these places? But as I kind of start thinking about it more and talking to him about it and learning the history of the shotgun house, it's coming out of the slave trade from West Africa into the U.S. and how vibrant these communities were, and how there was so much creativity. The architecture fit the communities that it was in. There was a social safety net in these kinds of communities, and educate all that. So he had this whole theory about shotgun communities, and so I kind of pushed this idea of making a living John Biggers painting as a social sculpture. And so then the process started. So I'm going to run through quickly some images here that shows just the transformation. And part of the process was the whole point of social sculpture, from my way of understanding it and the way that I practice it, is to create frameworks for other people to do creative things, not to do it yourself. And I teach, and I try to teach students about this, and it's so much easier, and we all know this, right? They say, if you want something done right, you might as well do it yourself. If you want it done on time, you have to do it yourself. But the trick to social sculpture is to be able to do it right and do it on time, or do it however with someone else. And that's the trick. How do you do that? And so this project just kind of unfolded. I mean, there's so many elements that I could talk about that was just magic. It was that kind of thing that happens when I'm in the studio now and I'm working and I'm finding there are magical moments that make the work works. And that's what happened here. So for instance, I'll just give a couple examples. And Suzanne, you were a part of this, as you said, you raked my yard. But one of there was a museum director at the Menil Collection in Houston who was interested. He saw an image of the little house, the first little house that we had renovated. I think it might have been the image in the upper right-hand side. And he wanted to come by and see them. And he asked us, he said, well, this is really interesting. And we have been told that it would cost us, a couple of $1 million to renovate these houses. But as stubborn artists, we decided to renovate one by ourselves to see what it would cost. So we did it, and it cost us, with paying licensed electricians and plumbers, it only took us about $5,000 with volunteer labor to do one house. And we told Paul that, and who was the director of the Menil, and he said, well, yeah, that's not bad, $5,000 to do that. He says, but how long did it take you to do it? And we're like, well, it took us about 6 months. And he said, well, okay, 6 months, 22 houses, it's going to take you 11 years. And so, he came back later and he said, I tell you what, I'm going to give the employees at the Menil off on Mondays to come and work on one of these houses. And I was like, wow, that's great. But his creativity kind of kicked in. He says, you know what? Actually, I'm going to challenge the other museums. And that's how the Contemporary Arts Museum, the Museum of Fine Arts, and then I began church groups, community groups, and so on and so forth. It just kind of unfold this in this way in which, it truly became a community project. And there were so many things, like the little drive-by exhibition at the bottom that we did to hold place, to keep the, to let people know that it wasn't just a housing development, but it was an art project. It had an art agenda. And then, so keeping in line with John Bigger's idea of what these communities meant and using him as a guidepost, we felt like doing the outside of the houses was honoring the architecture, which he said was key and foundational for these communities. But then the second thing he said, art and creativity was important. And he talked about how, that people couldn't afford to buy things, so they had to be creative. So people were constantly making clothing, making tools, and and so we decided to manifest that in this project by having visiting artists to come and do art projects within the community. And then education-wise, he talked about how, John Biggers talked about how education, in many of these communities was very informal, and it was just kind of a transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next off the back porches and stuff. And so we had this education program with young people, artist mentors, and just kind of working throughout the community. Wherever people wanted to work, we were just kind of shaping activities for them to engage in. And then the social safety net part, we, instead of doing an artist living residency on the site, we decided to take 7 houses and try to think creatively about what housing would be like for those who had less opportunities. And so we developed a transitional housing program for single mothers. And the core to this project, though, was the working with the mothers to design the interior of their own houses and working with sponsors and so on and so forth, creating houses that from the outside you would never imagine what they would look like on the inside, and having those young mothers, having that be the kickoff for them planning and making a new life for themselves. Okay, and so once we kind of got that rolling, then became, this thing of both, there was inside community, outside the community, people coming. There was a kind of fluidity of people being engaged and involved. There was the notion of expanding because of the real estate market pressures that were happening around. So we continued to work with architects and design housing that fit the context of the shotgun house. All of this stuff, though, was done with hours and hours and hours of community engagement. And this was actually one of my last things that I did at the project before I left in 2018. We felt like the scope of the challenges of the neighborhood was much, much larger than Project Door Houses. And we had to figure out how to get the churches involved. And, and as I said, you always think that it's easier to do it by yourself, but you really need other people. So we had to trick them into doing it, and so the point was to start this thing off, and we did all the work, but we put only church leaders in the forefront. We were doing all of their work for them, and by the time it got going, then they had bought into it, and now it's called the Emancipation Economic Development Council that's still operating today. Just some other examples of architectural forms. This is the context. So that, Project Door Houses, I worked on that project for around 25 years. And, but during that time, I had the opportunity to work on a number of different projects. And, some of them were more like, I think of them more like sketches. There were things that I just kind of, played out. They were short term and so on and so forth. But some of them actually, turn even a little bit longer than expected. So this one was a project that was done in conjunction with the National Sculpture Center in Dallas. And they were celebrating their 10th anniversary, so they had 10 artists to do 10 sculptural projects. And they asked me if I would do a social sculpture project. And so in trying to figure out where to work, a friend of mine told me about this neighborhood, Vickery Meadow, which is just north of downtown. And, and it was a neighborhood that was built mainly in the 70s as a kind of vibrant apartment living area, targeting mostly recent college grads and, that kind of group. And the way, with, the pools and all that stuff designed for people who had cars that they would drive into the neighborhood. You had all your stuff, then you drive out of the neighborhood to go to the stores, to do all that kind of stuff. And but and when I first visited this neighborhood, I didn't understand, why, like, somebody was telling me this was interesting. Um, but apparently what happened was that somewhere in the late 80s, there was, after some depreciation of the houses and some changes to housing laws, they had to remake most of these apartments, or a good number of these apartments, into family-size apartments, not just one bedrooms and studio apartments. They had to, have family apartments there. And it turns out that when I was working there, there was 52,000 apartments in this blue area. There's no sidewalks, no nothing. It's just people just drive in and out, whatever. But like I said, I didn't quite get it. Why it was interesting, until I started really going through and seeing how, like, there's this presence of violence, throughout. And it was like, these were just early on me just taking photographs of things I'm noticing happening in the neighborhood. And it's kind of daunting. And then the next thing I noticed was, as I start walking through, though, and seeing the wide range of colors of people and, and dress and stuff. And I'm like, this is kind of, and then I found out that really what this neighborhood had turned into was that because it had such a large number of apartments, the likelihood of having vacancies made it a good location for the International Refugee Committee and Catholic Charities to be able to place refugees when they came into the U.S. And so this neighborhood that was mainly designed as, kind of a young up-and-coming apartment community for young professionals or whatever, all of a sudden it was occupied by, immigrants and refugees. And while in these images you can see sidewalks, but there weren't a lot of sidewalks in this area. And so you'd see people walking in the streets and different dress, and it was fascinating. But then I started questioning, but what's the deal with all the violence? What's that? And so most of the people said, it's just, some people had just kind of written it off, like, we had violent people coming into our community. But I actually went kind of poking around. I managed to connect with a group of church ladies. They were hosting something they call the Mom's Lunch on Wednesdays. And they were operating from the standpoint, they said that they didn't believe that people were just naturally violent or anything. They said, I think they just don't know each other. And so they wanted to pull people together, and have them share and that kind of stuff. And I managed to, it's only for women, but I managed to talk my way into sitting in the back of the room so I could just kind of have the experience and see what they were doing. And it was one of the most amazing, 2 hours I've had watching. It's like maybe 5 or 6 women from 4 or 5 different countries. They're all, apparently each group would decide which one would bring the lunch for the next one. So, I think the one I was at, it was a group of women from Bhutan, and they had prepared the lunch, and they would just go around and they'd talk about their stories. And it was like so amazing, hearing them, just sharing, crying and hugging and, just building community. It was amazing. And so I left there thinking, wow, this city needs this, this community needs it. The city needs this kind of coming together. And so I started thinking, how do you do that and not exploit people? People don't need to be on stage in front of people. And so what I did was I started, as my team of people, I built a team of people in Dallas that were working with me, and we walked the streets and we talked to people. And then it came to our awareness that many of these people came from countries where they were accustomed to going to markets, and there was no market. So we said, let's do markets. Let's set up and do markets. And then we said, well, what's going to be at the market? How do you do this? And we said, there's got to be people that make things that you can sell at markets, so we just need to find them. Nobody understood what we were talking about when we were talking to them about a market and what they made, crafts and that kind of stuff. Nobody really got it. But going to these meetings, and one of the people came back and they said, they showed us something they had bought from someone because they were in their home and they saw this little purse thing on the table and they said, "Oh, where'd you get that? That's nice." She goes, "Oh, I made it." And then she was like, "But that's the kind of stuff we're talking about. Do you make this kind of stuff often?" And she was like, "Yeah, I make it, just for family stuff." And so we end up saying we have to get people to understand what it means, about making things for a market. So we got a couple of apartments there and had open door workshops to teach people crafts and things to make for the market. But as people could see what we were teaching, they were like, "Oh, but I do this and I do this." And next thing you know, the workshops were led by immigrants or refugees. And then so we built up enough stuff and we were going to have this market. And people were nervous about it because they were nervous about the violence. Of course, the museum was very nervous. They didn't want to. They were kind of like, "I don't know if anybody's going to go out there for that." But we named the event the Lucky Pot because we also thought if we could get people to bring food from different countries, it might be kind of interesting because that's what they were doing at the mom's lunch. And low expectations, thinking maybe we'll get 5 or 6 people. And we did this market, and it just, the people, like, I think we had like 18 different food varieties from different countries, incredible storytelling, sharing of information, all sitting under what we call the big tree. The big tree became significant because it was the drug tree. I mean, initially people were challenged by that tree because it had a hollow area, and apparently the drug dealers would just stash their drugs there and that kind of stuff. But as we started to generate this activity, it kind of, pushed things out. This thing was so incredible. The next markets, it just kept getting better and better. The next one we did, it was a talent show, which, we all thought like a talent show is ridiculous. Why you do that? It was a kid that suggested that, but we thought, okay, let's go with it. And we went with it, and it blew our socks off. I mean, there was like, the event was generally intended from 4 to 7, but we were there until like 9 o'clock trying to get all the performers through. I mean, the performers ranged from like a 3-year-old little girl from Somalia doing a traditional dance to a 96-year-old white guy doing a hokey pokey. It was just kind of a weird, and everybody's kind of, getting into these. So it was a way of just kind of cross-cultural references there. But another thing that happened that was kind of interesting, that there were a lot of people that we found that were actually, that made things that were not craft-oriented. They were real artists, and we're like, how do we show these people? And I was having a talk with a friend of mine, Mark Bradford. We were talking about his show that was at White Cube, and he was saying that he thought a painting was going to sell for over $1 million. And we were talking about that, and we were talking about what does the white cube symbolize? It's almost like the pedestal. It symbolizes value and that kind of stuff. And so I said, well, we need white cubes in Dallas. And so I went back and I talked to the architecture community, and I said, designers, we need some white cubes, and they kind of figured out this thing where there was a design competition. And so we had 4 of these little pods that were designed to show work in. Now, obviously, I mean, like this work in the lower left-hand side were copies. We made high-level copies of paintings by an Iraqi artist. They were just beautiful. There were all kinds of exhibitions in these spaces, and people use the spaces. They use them. Sometimes they use them just as a place to get out of the sun, out of the rain or whatever, or doing kind of events around it, that kind of stuff. They became hubs throughout the neighborhood. Now, the last one I'm going to talk about is Victoria Square project that started through Documenta, and it connects with the same issue that was going on in Dallas, because my first trip to Greece was in June of 2015, which was the month that they had to vote on whether they would leave the EU, the run of the banks, the economy, the refugee crisis. All that stuff was happening at that point, and I was asked to do something there for Documenta, and I was trying to figure it out. And I said, I just want to understand this situation. And what I found was that there was this weird dynamic in Greece at that time where there was conflict between the Greek natives and the refugees, but there was also a conflict between the immigrants and the refugees, because the immigrants they felt like they were lumped in with the refugees. And so they were trying to show the Greek natives that they were not refugees, so they would join the conservative folks to kind of push against the refugees. And so, my point was like kind of taking this thing of the mom's lunch. It's like, there has to be some kind of coming together and being able to understand each other beyond the political dynamics that are happening here. And this neighborhood called Victoria Square was kind of ground zero for the refugees. There were stories that somehow through the informal networks of where people should be, they would hear that when you get to Greece, if you can make it to Victoria Square, you can connect with other people that can help you get along. And so when I went there, I found this space. I'm going to go through this real quickly. I found this space that to me was a unique space, and that's kind of part of that's one of the things that I bring to social practice, is an eye for architecture and how it works within community contexts. And I say that in this context because this particular space, if you see like, these windows in this neighborhood, Victoria Square, there were no places that had big open windows, because the Golden Dawn, the Conservative Party, was notorious for going through and bashing windows and and trashing people's places and stuff. But when I saw this place, it was completely graffitied over, and I was like, this looks kind of interesting. So we just we got rid of the graffiti, cleaned the glass, and everybody kept warning, you got to be careful, because it's not gonna end well for you. And so I'm like, and so people say, you could put bars up and that kind of stuff. I'm like, but that defeats the purpose, I mean, you want people to feel like it's open and it's inviting and stuff. And then comes this kind of thing of community engagement. And I'll talk about this a little bit later about dominoes and the role that dominoes has played with my life. It's been a way for me to just kind of connect with people. So one day we've got the place cleaned up and we're sitting on pins and needles about whether somebody's gonna smash it in or not. And but one day I saw on the square, I saw there was some group of men huddled around, and I looked over and they were playing dominoes. And I was like, they were playing differently than I know how to play, but I watched long enough and I kind of picked it up. And they didn't speak English. And at a certain point, I kind of like said, and they were like, so they let me go in and play, and I held my own well enough to later find out that, this was mainly a core of Albanians. And afterwards, they came back to see what I was doing and all this stuff. And I was telling them I was nervous about the Golden Dawn, and they were like, "Don't worry, we'll take care of it. You don't have to worry about anything." And so, they became the guardians of that space. So the entire time of that project, nothing happened in that space. They took care of it. And then, in terms of building out the space in the program, working with refugee groups to design the interior, the exterior, the programming of it. And so this is local artists donating silk screen material, teaching silk screening to be able to do the exteriors. Then programming with the interior of the space was constantly active. The outside was constantly active with different kinds of artists, whether they were Greek artists, artists, refugee artists, immigrant artists, all over, just kind of coming in. And from traditional Greek stuff was included because we wanted it had to be centered around Greece. And but also then you'd have like these other things, like this was a Georgian fashion show, and the streets became like fantastic because it was a closed off street, and the municipality gave us free reign to just kind of use the street as our place, so we didn't have to do permitting and all that stuff. This was like Africa night or something like that, and a Greek traditional uh, singing evening. And then it became the point in which, politicians became, they saw it and they understood the symbolic nature of what this project was doing in terms of helping people see how they could come together in different ways. And so it became a platform for them to make sure that they're seen and they're known, like the bottom to the one in the white shirt here, and then he's in the blue shirt over there. That was the mayor who would often come to programs there. And then at the top in the white shirt, that's Kyriakos Mitsotakis, who's the current prime minister, who actually, kicked off his campaign in this area. And so, so it was just kind of the notion was kind of creating this symbolic place for people to deal with these challenging issues. But the Black Wall Street Journey project that is still ongoing now, and we're working on an exhibition for the University of Michigan because we're working with the Institute of Social Research at University of Michigan, trying to figure out how data is used to either encourage or hinder the progress of Blacks in America. And it's, data is a tricky thing, right? I mean, we always say, well, that's what the data says, but data is so funny. It can be used in so many different ways. One of the things that got me interested in this particular project was that the Tulsa Massacre was, and everybody, their hearts bleed for the people of Tulsa when you talk about the Tulsa Massacre and all that stuff. But there was also a side of the Tulsa Massacre that was pretty amazing, though, that it was an economically thriving community before and after the massacre. And so my thing was like, how do we build thriving economic communities? And one of the things that struck me as I started thinking about, I was working on the Tulsa project and thinking about just the journey of Black people economically, is that it's always shaped from the perspective of a deficit, and it's always talking about what's not there, and I like to think about it in terms of like, if we all decided we were going to run a marathon, this year, and we started just comparing ourselves to the elite marathon runners. I mean, would not. There's nothing that will inspire us to continue because we know we're not going to be there. We just know we're not going to be there. So, but if we start measuring ourselves based on what we're doing today, what we did last week and what we did the week, you start finding ways. You have to find ways to inspire yourself to move, and so I started trying to figure out and trying to research and find data and figure this whole thing. And so we now, through the Institute of Social Research, we're finally at a point now where we have a mechanism through which we can actually dig data out. Because there's so many things, like, for instance, I mean, of course, everybody knows that Black people are, we lag behind economically of other groups or whatever. But most people don't know that, Black people's, the purchasing power of Black people annually is like, it's somewhere around $2 trillion annually. I mean, okay, when you measure it against other groups or whatever, it may not be very much. But if you measure it against other countries, some countries don't have that, right? So, so just figuring out how do you redo this data? And so we're in the process of the ticker will be, in this iteration, will be even more so because we've figured out we have some technicians that they're figuring out how to use AI to kind of help us extrapolate that data and to be able to push it on a minute by minute basis. So, and that was always one of my things was when I first saw like the amount of resources that Black people have access to, I start thinking about it in terms of the Wall Street ticker. Like we can think about how the American economy is doing by the second, right? You just look at the ticker. It's like, can we get that granular? Now, as an art project, we can do that. Using AI, to help do it. It's not completely scientific, but it will give an example and a sense of what that would look like. Anyway. But I'm going to move on to my last little part here, which is dominoes. Dominoes was something that I learned early on with Project Horizon that, in order to get real conversation with people, I had to be at the domino table. I mean, I had to get in that context where people felt comfortable. And but being someone with not a good attention span. I mean, I drift off all the time. I found myself drifting out of the games. And when the iPhone came around, was a perfect tool for me to just take photos. We would play a game and I would just snap some photos of it. And then eventually I ended up shifting from just taking photographs of them to actually tracing them out as we're playing games. And then actually even kind of adding more elements to it as I'm kind of doing this. And there was no real intention about moving to a studio practice doing this. It was just something that I was just kind of doing. But fortunately, thanks to my buddy William Cordova, who couldn't get here today, who's from here. William came by a little place I was using at the time to do these little sketches, and he was like, "Oh, these are interesting." He says, he got me into the Prism art fair here, so that was my first time kind of showing, and then later he got me into this little show at Storage Gallery in New York, which then that's where my work was seen, and I made it into Gagosian. But this was just kind of my early examples of just the authentic nature of playing the game, keeping the scores, and kind of dictating it a little bit. And that kind of moved into me kind of saying, well, what if I just not draw them and I just cut these little things and make them and just play them out as imaginary games? And so it evolved into this. But then I also went back to the drawing of them, because there's something about like the one of the things I liked about the drawing aspect was that it could become meditative, it just kind of repetitive, it's meditative. And so on the left-hand side was the first ones that I was doing when I was kind of doing them the way that we would play the game, and the way that we play in Houston and in many places in the South. You play with what they call a spinner, and you can go like in 4 different directions. However, many people from the Caribbean, and I think this is the way they probably play in Miami, is they play in one line. But so I got into this thing. I said, well, I should do it the other way. I should do it like that. And when I did it, it wasn't that interesting until I cut them up. And then I start cutting them up. And then you start like making these kind of really weird hieroglyphic-y kinds of things that I got really fascinated with. And I'm still trying to, to push that idea, of kind of, because people always say at the domino table, there's a language at the domino table. There's a kind of wisdom that's happening there. And so I'm trying to figure out how to capture that through these drawings and just kind of reconfiguring them and trying to figure out how to weed the ones out that didn't work and the ones that can work more fluidly as a kind of domino hieroglyphic. And then those end up kind of being able to create a different kind of dynamic as they're put together and played out in imaginary domino games, right? So they're just overlapping and overplaying of these games and one of the things that was kind of interesting about this though was that I've always been fascinated with maps, and particularly working with project warehouses when we start dealing with real estate and land acquisition. And I started to learn. I mean, someone taught me early on in this. They said, if you want to know what's going to happen in your neighborhood, you got to learn how to read those infrastructure maps. And so I started looking at infrastructure maps and land use maps and seeing, and they're always colorful and they're interesting for me. And then it was interesting that once I started doing these domino things, they've started to feel like maps. And so it wasn't like I set out to do maps, but they just kind of started. And also, also because at the time of doing this painting, I'm working in a very small space, so I couldn't do large scale stuff. And but early on in those early paintings that I was doing, that I showed in the beginning, those were all, I had a format because they were intended to not be archival. I mean, in fact, they were intended to just be rough and rugged, to be used at protests and that kind of stuff. So I would paint them on plywood, and I could use full sheets of plywood. So I could do a painting that's 4x8, or I can add another one that's 8x8, right? 8x12, and I just keep going, adding. And so I brought that knowledge that experience into trying to make larger work where I was working with a space that I couldn't operate that way. And then that also fit in with this notion of folded maps. I always loved, when you have those who remember maps, you get these folded maps and you're trying to find a place, but it got a seam right there on the place you're trying to find out where it is. You can't read, And so the multi-panel pieces became kind of this notion of these maps. And so this piece is like 12 feet by 28 feet long. 12 feet tall by 28 long. And this is another kind of version of that. But I think it's only 3 panels. And just kind of moving back and forth between, the ones that are kind of allowing me to kind of just deal with color in the domino chips, and then the ones that goes back into the hieroglyphics that end up making these kind of map or forms, whatever. This is piece. And I think this is the last piece here. And I'll just say that, in closing, it's been an interesting journey to kind of start with a highly charged activist mindset. And I attribute that to my youthfulness, of that having that youthful clarity, where you think exactly what, this is right and this is wrong and these are the, it's very clear. And when you have that kind of clarity, your energy just goes like crazy on that. And so I had that when I was doing those kind of political didactic paintings. But I lost that clarity when the student challenged me on it. I broke the clarity. It's like, well, wait a minute. It's not so clear that this is having any impact. I mean, having the kind of impact that I'd like. So then I moved into the social sculpture work because I thought I could get a stronger impact. And I had the same kind of conviction about what I was doing, and how it fit in my ethical framework of things. And until when I ended up leaving Project Horizons in 2018, it was a very odd feeling to leave a place that you that you started, It's probably, maybe it's a little bit different, but I say it's probably almost like parents with children, when they get to that age and they move out, and it's like there's a sense and then you get to watch them and you think all the things you deposited into them, and you realize, oh, they're not taking that, they're not doing what I thought they would do, and you get a little, you question yourself. And so that moment kind of had me questioning myself. And I went back and I went back to studies. Well, I was looking through some old stuff and I saw this book that I read in 1991, maybe it was 90. it was, and I just tossed it away, but it was in a stack of books, and it just fell in my hand. And I thought, oh, well, this is interesting. There might be something here. But it's a book by a 5th or 6th century Roman philosopher by the name of Boethius. Anybody know Boethius? He's kind of a rare person. I mean, he's mostly known for translating most of the Greek stuff. But he wrote this one book, and it's called The Consolation of Philosophy. And the reason that he wrote the book was that, well, his life was that he loved philosophy. He embraced it, and he put it into practice. I mean, because, as Aristotle would say, philosophy is not just to be a theoretical thing, it's to be applied. Boethius applied it. He got himself elected to the Roman Senate. He had 2 sons in the Roman Senate. He's doing everything that you're supposed to do. Yet and still, he ends up being betrayed by the Senate and sentenced to death. So he writes this book as he's waiting his execution. And so in the book, he's kind of pining to philosophy, saying like, what is this? I did everything I was supposed to do. How did I end up here? And so comes down from above is this character that he has. It's called Lady Philosophy, who comes down to console him. And the essence of the book is basically what Lady Philosophy is trying to get him to understand is that, and this is one of the challenges that I had to kind of get beyond, is this idea of impact. Impact has been pushed upon artists who are interested in socially engaged work, which we all want impact, but that's not the only reason to do it. And Lady Philosophy says, look, philosophy is about virtue. You don't strive for virtue to get good impacts. You strive for virtue because it's who you are. It's the character that you want to have, because there are good people who have very bad fortune, and there are bad people that have very good fortune. So you can't allow impact to be the determining factor of why you do something. And so, it took me, all these years kind of, focusing on this idea of trying to do work that has a particular kind of impact, and getting to the point where I understand now better is really, it's just about doing the work. It's about having the privilege to do the work. Thank you.